The story of Carthage is usually reduced to three things: Hannibal, elephants, and the phrase Carthage must be destroyed. But behind that cliché lies a civilization that lasted nearly 700 years, a trading power whose ships reached from Britain to West Africa, whose political system Aristotle ranked among the finest examples of mixed government in the known world, whose alphabet became the ancestor of most writing systems used today. This is a story about how trade collides with war, how wealth breeds envy, and how envy becomes a justification for annihilation, and about how an entire culture can vanish, not because it was weak, but because it was inconvenient to the victor. There is another side to this story, too: silence. Carthage left behind almost no voice of its own. The Phoenicians invented the alphabet. They had literature, chronicles, religious and scientific treatises. But almost none of it survives. Everything detailed we know about Carthage comes from Greek and Roman writers. That is, from its enemies. It is a little like studying a nation's history, using only the records of the people who destroyed it. Keep that in mind as this story unfolds. Flight from Tyre. In the 9th century BC, King Madon of the Phoenician city of Tyre died, leaving the throne to his two children, his son Pygmalion and his daughter Elissa, later known as Dido. Unwilling to share power, Pygmalion had his sister's husband, the high priest Acherbes, murdered for his hidden wealth. Realizing she would be next, Elissa refused to fight a war she could not win. Instead, she gathered loyal aristocrats, secretly loaded ships with gold, tricking her brother, according to legend, into believing she was casting her dead husband's treasure into the sea, and fled Tyre for good. After long wanderings, her fleet reached a bay on the North African coast. The site was ideal: a headland surrounded by water on three sides, with fertile land beyond. But the territory belonged to local Libyan tribes. Elissa asked their chief for only as much land as a single ox hide could cover, and once he agreed, ordered the hide cut into razor-thin strips, encircling an entire hill. That hill, Bursa, became the citadel. Around it rose the city of Carthage, New City, which the Greeks called Carchedon and the Romans Carthago. The city was built to a plan from the start: orderly grids of streets, multi-story houses with running water, temples to Baal Hammon, and the goddess Tanid. Legend holds that Elissa herself later climbed a funeral pyre and took her own life rather than marry a Libyan king under threat of war, an act of sacrifice that would become Carthage's founding symbol. The city stood above any single life, including hers. Ruler of the sea. By the mid-7th century BC, as the Phoenician homeland fell under Assyrian pressure, Carthage assumed leadership of all the western Phoenician settlements. This was the birth of a thalassocracy, dominance built entirely on control of the sea. Its symbol was the harbor of Kothon, a rectangular commercial basin, and behind it, hidden, a circular military port with an artificial island at its center, housing the admiralty, a vantage point that could see the entire harbor while remaining invisible from the open sea. Around its rim stood dry docks for 200 warships. Carthaginian shipwrights pioneered something close to mass production. Every component was stamped with a code, letting the Navy rebuild its losses within weeks. Carthaginian captains sailed past the Pillars of Hercules into waters other sailors called the Sea of Darkness. The navigator Hanno led an expedition of 60 ships down the West African coast, describing erupting volcanoes and hairy creatures his translators called gorillas. Hamilco explored the Atlantic coast of Europe in search of tin. With tribes who shared no common language, Carthaginians practiced silent trade, laying out goods on the shore and withdrawing, waiting for locals to leave gold in exchange. And, as Herodotus noted, neither side ever cheated the other. Rule of the few. Carthage was neither an Eastern despotism nor a democracy in the Greek sense. At its head stood two suffets, senior magistrates elected annually but explicitly barred from commanding armies, so that no single man could hold both civil and military power at once. The real center of politics was the Council of 104, a lifetime body drawn from the wealthiest families, empowered to try and execute any general for defeat or excessive ambition. The popular assembly convened only when the suffets and council failed to agree. It was an oligarchy in which wealth was treated as proof of merit, and yet Aristotle ranked its constitution alongside Sparta's as one of the most stable in the known world. The economy rested on more than trade. The scholar Mago wrote a landmark treatise on agriculture, so valuable that after Carthage fell, the Roman Senate ordered it translated into Latin above all other Punic texts. On vast African estates, worked by slaves and subject Libyan farmers, Carthaginians grew olives, grapes, and pomegranates, the Punic apples. But citizens themselves rarely fought. Carthage went to war on hired soldiers, Numidian cavalry, Iberian infantry, Balearic slingers, a choice that would later become one of the causes of its downfall. The city and its people. Picture Carthage from the inside. A headland jutting into the bay, sea on three sides, a fortified isthmus on the fourth. On the rise stood Byrsa Hill, crowned with temples and aristocratic houses. Below, closer to the water, ran the artisans' quarters, narrow streets, houses 6 or 7 stories tall, an extraordinary rarity anywhere in the ancient world. Flat roofs where laundry dried and evenings were spent. The harbor never fell silent. Creaking ropes, hammer blows, the shouts of dockworkers in a dozen languages: Phoenician, Berber, Greek, Iberian. Society was strictly hierarchical. At the top, the Phoenician aristocracy, controlling major trade and public office. Below them, free artisans and small traders. Below that, a subject Libyan population that paid tribute and held no political rights. Polybius records that in some years, conquered farmers surrendered up to half their harvest, a burden that periodically erupted into revolts crushed without mercy. At the very bottom, slaves. And yet Carthage remained remarkably open to outside influence. Greek deities were absorbed into its pantheon, and its artisans freely borrowed motifs from Egypt and Greece to create a distinctive hybrid style all their own. Tophet and the gods of Carthage. Religious life centered on the supreme god Baal-Hamon and the goddess Tanit, whose symbol, a stylized female figure with raised arms, became one of the most recognizable emblems of Punic culture. But the darkest and most disputed aspect of Carthaginian religion concerns a place called the Tophet. Ancient authors, Greek and Roman alike, claimed unanimously that Carthaginians sacrificed children, particularly firstborns of noble families, at moments of gravest danger to the city. Archaeologists excavating the Tophet did find thousands of urns containing the cremated remains of infants and young animals. But what actually took place there remains one of the fiercest debates in modern scholarship. Some researchers accept the ancient testimony at face value. Others point out that nearly all of it comes from Carthage's enemies, who had every reason to demonize their rival, and argue the Tophet may have primarily been a burial ground for children who died of natural causes, with the animal remains marking ritual substitute offerings. The truth likely lies somewhere between the extremes. Child sacrifice probably did occur, but almost certainly on a far smaller scale than Roman propaganda claimed. We will likely never know for certain, because Carthage never left us its own account. Stalemate in Sicily. By the start of the 5th century BC, Carthaginian trading interests collided with Greek colonists on Sicily, an island sitting astride the Mediterranean's main shipping lanes. In 480 BC, the same year the Greeks fought the Persians at Salamis, A Carthaginian army under Hamilcar was crushed outside the city of Himera. Seeing the battle lost, the general threw himself onto a sacrificial fire. Carthage abandoned any conquest of the island for 70 years, paying a massive indemnity, and drew a lasting lesson. A citizen militia could never match seasoned Greek hoplites. From then on, the city relied permanently on mercenary armies. Clashes on Sicily flared again and again against the tyrant Dionysius of Syracuse, and later against the general Timoleon, who crushed Carthage's elite sacred band, drawn from the city's noblest families, at the Battle of the Crimesis. Decades of war produced a fragile equilibrium. The west of the island stayed Punic, the east Greek. But this long struggle over Sicilian vineyards became both Carthage's training ground and the trap that would eventually drag it into the conflict that destroyed it. The First Punic War. In 264 BC, a dispute over the Sicilian city of Messina turned the trade treaties between Carthage and Rome into worthless parchment. What followed was a 23-year war. At first, Carthage ruled the sea unchallenged, but Rome showed a rare talent for learning on the fly. Copying a captured Carthaginian warship, it built its own fleet and invented the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that turned naval battles into infantry brawls. Rome's legionaries were built to win. In 260 BC at Mylae, the once invincible Punic navy suffered its first defeat. The war swung back and forth. A Roman landing in Africa under Regulus was crushed after Carthage hired the Spartan mercenary Xanthippus, who deployed war elephants to devastating effect. On Sicily, Hamilcar Barca, father of the future Hannibal, waged a brilliant guerrilla campaign, never once beaten in open battle. But in 241 BC, off the Aegates Islands, a fleet financed by Rome's wealthiest citizens crushed the Carthaginians in the decisive battle. Carthage sued for peace, total evacuation of Sicily, a crushing indemnity. The war had barely ended when Carthage found itself unable to pay the mercenaries who had fought it. Rebellion followed, what Polybius called the Truceless War, a conflict without rules that nearly destroyed the city outright. Only Hamilcar Barca's generalship saved it, and Rome, exploiting the chaos, treacherously seized Sardinia and Corsica, a betrayal that planted in Hamilcar's heart a hatred he would pass on to his son. Hannibal and the Triumph of Will. Hamilcar set out to build a new power base in Spain, taking his 9-year-old son with him. At the altar, he made the boy swear eternal enmity toward Rome. That boy was Hannibal. By 26, Hannibal commanded the Barcid army in Spain, and in 218 BC, by besieging Rome's ally Saguntum, he engineered a war. Then, instead of the expected defensive campaign, invaded Italy himself, crossing the Alps with infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. The crossing took 15 days and cost him half his army, but the shock value was total. Victories at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene stunned Rome, and on August 2nd, 216 BC at Cannae, Hannibal, outnumbered 2-1, encircled and annihilated the largest army Rome had ever fielded, killing more than 50,000 men in a single day. He never marched on Rome itself. He lacked the siege engines and the manpower. For 15 years, he remained in Italy, winning skirmishes but unable to force a decision, as Carthage's government sent him only meager reinforcements. Meanwhile, the young Roman Publius Cornelius Scipio seized the Barcid strongholds in Spain and then landed in Africa. Recalled home, Hannibal was defeated at Zama in 202 BC. The peace was catastrophic: loss of every overseas territory, a ban on any fleet or war without Rome's permission. Hannibal briefly served as a reforming suffet, cleaning up Carthage's finances before being betrayed by his own elite, forced into exile, and in 183 BC, surrounded by Roman agents, took poison rather than be captured. Agony and the salted earth. Even disarmed, Carthage rebuilt its wealth astonishingly fast, and this brought Rome not relief, but fear. The senator Marcus Porcius Cato, after visiting the city, was so unsettled by its prosperity that he began ending every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the same line. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. A pretext arrived when the Numidian king Massinissa, for decades allowed by Rome to nibble away at Carthaginian land, provoked the Carthaginians into striking back without Roman permission. Rome declared war. Carthage tried desperately to buy peace, handing over 300 hostages from its noblest families, surrendering all its weapons, 2,000 catapults, 200,000 sets of armor. But when Rome's final demand came, abandon the city and resettle inland, this disarmed nation of sailors answered with desperate resistance. Temples were stripped for metal. Women cut their hair to string new catapults. Within a month, the city had produced thousands of new weapons. The siege lasted 3 years. In 146 BC, the army of Scipio Aemilianus broke into the city, and the fighting raged for 6 days and nights, street by street, floor by floor. The last defenders barricaded themselves in the temple atop Bursa Hill. Legend says the wife of the commander Hasdrubal, cursing her husband's surrender as cowardice, threw their children into the flames and leapt in after them. Of a population once nearing 1 million, only about 50,000 survived, all sold into slavery. The city burned for 17 days before being razed to the ground. The legend that the ruins were sown with salt is likely untrue, but symbolically apt. The site was declared cursed. Scipio himself, watching the fire, is said by Polybius to have quoted Homer's lines on the fall of Troy, confessing his fear that Rome too would meet the same fate one day. The silence of history. The Latin phrase "vis punica," Punic faith, became a byword for treachery. Rome projected onto Carthage every quality it considered the opposite of its own virtues: commerce instead of valor, cunning instead of honesty. How much of that reflected reality, we can hardly verify. Not one Carthaginian history, poem, or treatise survives, only quotations and paraphrases in the writings of Greek and Roman authors describing their enemy. Later ages, lacking any voice of Carthage's own, filled in its image as they pleased. Medieval Europe knew the city chiefly through Virgil's Aeneid, as the realm of tragic Dido, who loved and lost Aeneas. Enlightenment thinkers, Montesquieu among them, read the rivalry of Carthage and Rome as a clash between two principles, the commercial and the military. In the 19th century, Gustave Flaubert devoted a novel, Salammbô, to the city, a vivid, bloody fantasy that, whatever its historical accuracy, did more to popularize Carthage than any scholarly work. And after Tunisia won independence in 1956, Carthage became a symbol of pre-colonial African statehood. Hannibal, a national hero on banknotes and stamps. His ruins, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Legacy. Carthage was never truly erased. Dozens of other Punic cities survived under Roman rule, preserving language and tradition. 3 centuries later, St. Augustine wrote that peasants in North Africa still called themselves Canaanites. On the ruins, under Julius Caesar and Augustus, rose a new Roman Carthage, soon the second largest city in the West, home to early Christian thinkers like Tertullian and Cyprian. Mago's agricultural treatise shaped Roman farming for centuries, and the Phoenician alphabet, passed through Greek and Latin hands, became the ancestor of most writing systems in use today. The story of Carthage is not the story of villains, as its conquerors painted it. It is the story of explorers and traders who first stitched the shores of the Mediterranean into a single economic system, a civilization that lost, not because it was weaker, but because its model, a trading oligarchy, a hired army, fractured power, proved less resilient under total war than Rome's citizen legions and web of alliances. Rome could lose an army at Cannae and raise a new one from its own citizens. Carthage, having lost its army at Zama, had to hire a new one, and by then it had no time, no money, and no luck left to spare. Today, on the site of the ancient city, lies a quiet Tunis suburb. White villas among palm trees, Roman bathhouse ruins standing beside fragments of Punic walls, and the outline of the legendary harbor of Kothon, still traceable in silted lagoons where birds now nest. Cities turn to ash and their names into legend. But no sword and no salt can erase what a people gave to the story of humanity. And every time we set down a word in letters, we are drawing on the inheritance of a people whose own libraries were burned to nothing. Thank you for watching.